Happy full moon, and welcome to the first full episode of the Mending Song. Today I want to talk about spiritual practitioners and counselors, why someone might seek out one or the other, why someone might choose both, and why I don't believe these practices need to be positioned as enemies. I hear that framing all the time. Why are you seeing a psychic when you should be seeing a therapist? Why are you asking a tarot reader when you should be working through this in counseling? I don't like the premise of that question. Counseling and spiritual guidance are two roads, both alike in dignity. They can both be useful. They can both be transformative. They can both be practiced ethically. And they can both cause real harm when they're not. They may sometimes run alongside one another, and occasionally a person might come to a fork where either road looks possible. But they're not the same. They don't lead to all the same places, and one can't simply substitute one for the other. They're different tools. Both can help us explore patterns in our lives. Both might help us talk about our past and consider our future. They both might help us encounter parts of ourselves that are difficult to access directly. Depending on the practitioner, both may talk about the mind, the body, relationships, meaning, intuition, energy, or the unconscious. But they come to those subjects through different traditions, different bodies of knowledge, different kinds of training, and different ideas about what the work is for. So today I want to talk about those differences, but I also want to talk about the overlap. I want to talk about the particular things spiritual care can offer, and the particular things counseling can offer, and the very real reasons people might choose one, avoid one, or keep both in their toolbox. Before we go any further, I should explain why I'm saying spiritual practitioner or spiritual advisor instead of just psychic. I use several different terms for my own work, and I use them pretty specifically. Psychic is often the marketing label. It's the word people understand when they're looking for someone who can perceive information intuitively or through extrasensory means. If we're talking about how I function psychically, we might be talking about empathy, claircognizance, mediumship, channeling, omen reading, or other forms of divination. Tarot reader is even more specific. If you come to me for a psychic reading, we're probably going to take out the tarot cards because for me, tarot is the quickest and easiest way to access and organize information. It gives us shared symbolic language and something concrete to look at together. But spiritual advising is much broader than either psychic perception or tarot. Spiritual advising can include questions of faith, religious identity, ethics, ritual, grounding, centering, cleansing, prayer, relationships with gods, spirits, ancestors, descendants, land, and community. It can include how you move through the seasons and cycles of your life, how you observe holidays, how you care for your spiritual life, and how you understand your obligations to other people and to the world around you. It can include weddings and funerals, bereavement support, baby blessings, rites of passage, devotional practice, and the moments when somebody says, something happened to me and I need to understand what this means within the story of my life. Spiritual advisors include tarot readers and mediums, but they also include high priestesses, priests, rabbis, imams, chaplains, ministers, reverends, elders, and other people who serve within religious and spiritual traditions. I'm a tarot reader and psychic, but I'm also an ordained minister, a reverend specifically. That means my work isn't limited to telling somebody whether their ex is going to call. I have ministerial and pastoral responsibilities, a lineage of practice, an ethical framework, and a religious community that gives the work context. Counseling is also broader than the stereotype of lying on a couch while somebody asks how you feel about your mother. Counselors may help people understand emotions, relationships, behavior, development, identity, trauma, grief, anxiety, depression, stress, disability, family systems, coping, and the effects of lived experience on the mind and the body. Depending on their credentials and training, they may assess symptoms, diagnose mental health conditions, create treatment plans, teach evidence-informed skills, provide crisis support, and coordinate with other healthcare professionals. The study of the human psyche is profound work. I would call it sacred work, although a counselor doesn't need to understand it that way, and a client certainly doesn't need to bring spirituality into counseling if they don't want to. This is one of the things I was delighted to learn when I returned to school. Counseling no longer has to maintain an absolute wall between psychological life and spiritual life. There are counselors being trained to work competently with religion and spirituality as part of a client's culture and worldview. And most importantly, with the client's consent. Spiritually integrated counseling should mean the client's spirituality on the client's terms in service of the client's goals. It should not mean the counselor gets to bring their Christianity, paganism, atheism, or any other worldview into the room and impose it on somebody who didn't ask for it. And a person has just as much right to request entirely secular counseling. Consent works in both directions. So why might somebody seek out a psychic or another spiritual practitioner? The first and most obvious answer is that they actually want spiritual work. Sometimes people seem to think folks only go to a psychic because they couldn't find a therapist, didn't understand therapy, or are trying to obtain therapy through some back door. Sometimes they want a tarot reading because they believe tarot is useful. Sometimes they want a medium because they want to communicate with their beloved dead. Sometimes they want a minister because they're facing a theological or moral question. Sometimes they want ritual because ritual is the appropriate response within their tradition. A counselor is not ordinarily going to tell you what your cards say, help you establish an ancestor altar, conduct a house blessing, officiate your wedding, initiate you into a religious tradition, or help you understand your obligations to a deity. Those aren't failures of counseling. They're just spiritual work. People who seek out spiritual practitioners may be asking questions that scientific research isn't designed to answer. They may want to know what a dream means within their tradition, whether an omen is significant, what lesson they believe a relationship carries, or how to understand a mystical experience. That doesn't mean science is bad. It means not every question is a scientific question. There's also practical reasons someone might seek spiritual support in an area where counseling and spiritual care overlap. A psychic may be available much more quickly. You may be able to call within a few minutes rather than waiting weeks or months. You don't need insurance, a referral, a diagnosis, or a formal intake. You can often choose the subject, ask the question that matters right now, and end the interaction when you're finished. That doesn't always make psychic work inexpensive. Pay-by-the-minute platforms can become very expensive very quickly. Accessibility and affordability aren't the same thing. But the client can often reach somebody immediately, from home, without navigating a healthcare system. There's also a meaningful difference in privacy. A tarot reading is generally not entered into your medical chart. A psychic doesn't ordinarily send a summary to your primary care doctor. Your spiritual questions don't automatically become clinical symptoms, diagnostic information, or part of a treatment record. That doesn't mean every spiritual service is totally private. Online platforms may collect account, message, or payment data. Individual practitioners may keep notes. Ministers and spiritual practitioners can also have legal or ethical obligations. But I can't promise every reading everywhere is completely anonymous and beyond all disclosure. But it usually remains outside the healthcare system, and that distinction matters. Some services allow a client to use a screen name, communicate by text, or speak by phone without ever showing their face. They may be able to say the weird thing, the embarrassing thing, the dream, the omen, the presence they felt in the hallway, or the thought they're afraid will make someone judge them. And psychics are already weird. We're already talking about tarot cards, dead people, synchronicities, gods, intuition, and spooky things. The client can tell us something strange without first having to calculate whether we're going to interpret the strangeness itself as a symptom. And that can be a huge relief. The Pew Research Center surveyed over 9,500 American adults in 2024. 30% said they consult astrology or horoscopes, tarot cards, fortune tellers, at least once or twice a year. 11% said they consult tarot cards specifically. Most people who used at least one of these practices said they mostly did it for fun, while the Pew estimates that 10% of U.S. adults use them primarily because they believe they offer helpful insights. Very few said they relied heavily on those insights for major life decisions. 1% said they relied on them a lot, and another 5% said they relied on them just a little. That's worth emphasizing because the popular image is often somebody surrendering every decision to a deck of cards. Most people aren't doing that. Pew also found that people from more marginalized groups are more likely to consult spiritual practitioners. LGBTQIA adults, younger adults, lower income adults, and Black, Asian, and Hispanic adults all reported higher rates of participation. The survey doesn't establish why, and I won't say it does, but it does give us a reason to ask what alternative spaces might offer people who haven't always been respected, believed, or safely held by mainstream institutions. There's also a study that looked directly at psychics as a source of emotional support. Researchers surveyed 734 adults who sought help for stress or emotional problems from one of four sources: psychologists or counselors, doctors or psychiatrists, friends or family, or psychics and similar alternative providers. Across all four groups, people generally described their choice of helper as reasonable. The people who had consulted psychics reported higher overall effectiveness than the other three groups, and very few people in any of the groups reported adverse outcomes. It's interesting, but it doesn't prove that psychic readings outperform therapy. This was a self-reported survey. People were not randomly assigned to a helper, and we don't know whether the groups began with the same problems, expectations, resources, or level of distress. What it does show, though, is that people often choose psychics intentionally, experience the work as useful, and include spiritual practitioners within their real-world systems of care. And that matters. I've read tarot and provided spiritual guidance for about 30 years now, since before high school, and I know that people usually show up with a question that isn't really what they're looking for. They ask, is he going to call? Is she coming back? Am I going to reconnect with my ex? But often what they really want to know is, am I going to be alone forever? Was this my last chance to be loved? Am I a terrible person? Did this relationship mean anything? Is there something wrong with me? Will I ever be happy again? The surface question may be predictive. The deeper question is often about meaning, worth, hope, grief, identity. We can offer perspective, help the client see choices, name patterns, remind them that one relationship isn't the final judgment on if they're worthy. And that's real support. Spiritual practice also isn't limited to reassurance, prediction, and making people feel better. It can involve shadow work. It can ask us to confront the parts of ourselves that we reject, hide, project onto other people, or refuse to acknowledge. It can require moral inventory, accountability, restitution, changes in behavior, and an honest examination of the stories we tell about ourselves. A spiritual practitioner may help someone recognize that they keep repeating the same pattern, that their intentions don't erase their impact, or that the thing they're calling intuition is sometimes fear, desire, prejudice, or an old wound. It's not the same thing as clinical trauma treatment or psychotherapy, but it is serious internal work, and it's one of the ways spiritual traditions have helped people examine themselves long before modern counseling existed. It's not the same thing as treating attachment trauma, depression, compulsive behavior, or a mental health condition, but it's not nothing just because it's different. Now, what's down the other road? Why might someone seek a counselor? Because counseling can do work that spiritual advising can't. A counselor can build a sustained therapeutic relationship over time. They can help a person examine how childhood trauma, attachment, family systems, social conditions, relationships, thoughts, behavior, and the body are interacting in the present. They can teach and practice specific skills. They can assess risk. They can help create a safety plan. They can treat a diagnosed mental health condition within their scope. They can recognize when a person may need psychiatric medication, medical evaluation, a higher level of care, or a different specialist. A qualified counselor may offer structured trauma treatment, grief counseling, family therapy, addiction treatment, support for obsessive or compulsive patterns, or help with symptoms that are making it difficult to work, sleep, eat, maintain relationships, or carry out ordinary life. A diagnosis can cause harm when it's inaccurate, biased, stigmatizing, or allowed to overshadow the rest of a person. But diagnosis can also be useful. It can give somebody language for an experience, open access to treatment, make insurance coverage possible, support disability claims or accommodations, and connect someone with resources developed for the problem they're actually experiencing. Regulation also provides things that the spiritual marketplace often doesn't. Licensed counselors have educational requirements, supervised clinical experience, examinations, ethical codes, defined scopes of practice, and formal complaint and disciplinary systems. Continuing education requirements vary by license and state, but there is at least an external structure that says this practitioner has responsibilities beyond their own opinion of themselves. That obviously doesn't guarantee that every counselor is ethical, culturally competent, spiritually literate, or right for every client. But it does mean there are standards and possible consequences when those standards are violated. I want to say clearly that counseling is not only for people in crisis. Seeking counseling does not mean you are defective, weak, unstable, or incapable of handling your own life. I think a lot of people could benefit from good counseling at some point, provided they want it and can find a counselor who is actually safe and appropriate for them. I would love to live in a world where mental health care was available as ordinary care, not reserved for the moment someone's already falling apart. I support counseling strongly enough that I'm pursuing clinical education myself. I'm interested in counseling, somatics, trauma, chronic illness, and the ways our histories and environments live in our body. But supporting counseling doesn't mean I think that the mental health system is always safe. Some people can't access therapy. Some people don't want therapy. Some people are actively opposed to therapy. And sometimes they have very good reasons. According to SAMHSA's 2024 National Survey, among adults with any mental illness who perceived an unmet need for mental health treatment, 71% said they thought they should be able to handle their mental health, emotions, or behavior all on their own. 65% said treatment would cost too much. About half didn't know how or where to get treatment, and 45% couldn't find a program or professional they wanted. Insurance coverage, transportation, appointment availability, privacy concerns, time, and stigma can all become barriers. But access isn't the whole issue. Sometimes people distrust therapy because therapy has harmed them. Mental health care can be racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic, classist, fatphobist and sizist, culturally ignorant, religiously prejudiced, coercive, and just plain judgmental. Counselors are human beings. Licensure doesn't remove the biases of the practitioner, the assumptions of their training, or the power structures of the institution where they work. A 2024 systemic review of intersectional discrimination in mental health care found recurring concerns involving the relevance of social identity, gaps in provider knowledge, microaggressions in clinical practice, and the ways service users tried to navigate or protect themselves from discriminatory care. Racial diagnostic disparities are also well documented. A meta-analysis found that Black people in the United States were diagnosed with schizophrenia at substantially higher rates than white people. So when a marginalized person says, "I don't trust that system," we shouldn't treat their distress as ignorance, stigma, paranoia, or resistance to getting better. Sometimes distrust is information. Sometimes what a clinician calls paranoia is a person's accurate recognition that an institution isn't safe for them. Sometimes anger is an appropriate response to injustice. Sometimes poverty can't be reframed away. Sometimes exhaustion is disability. Sometimes the problem isn't that the client has misunderstood reality, the clinician has. I've personally had psychosis placed in my medical record because I'm pagan, practice witchcraft, and read tarot. And I'm a middle-aged white woman who knows how to speak the language of institutions and look respectable when I need to. If I can be pathologized simply for mentioning my practice, I'm not going to pretend the risk is imaginary for people carrying additional marginalizations. That medical record matters. HIPAA gives separately maintained psychotherapy notes special protection, but psychotherapy notes is a narrower category than many people assume. Diagnosis, symptoms, functional status, treatment plans, prognosis, progress summaries, medication information, and ordinary clinical notes can remain part of a medical record and can be shared with other providers for treatment and care coordination. And once a psychiatric label is present, it can affect how physical symptoms are interpreted. There's a name for that. It's diagnostic overshadowing. Diagnostic overshadowing is when physical symptoms are misattributed to a mental health condition. A recent systematic review found evidence that people with mental health conditions face increased risk of physical illnesses being missed or diagnosed late. Among the studies with robust comparison groups, 29 studies out of 37 found a significantly increased risk. Among the smaller group of studies designed to better isolate professional and healthcare system factors, 14 studies out of 15 found evidence of greater diagnostic errors. It's not just an emotional discomfort. It can delay diagnosis and treatment of serious physical illness. I know this from experience. Symptoms from my autoimmune illness were dismissed for decades as anxiety. I still have words like non-compliant and defiant in my medical record because I insisted that something physical was wrong and didn't accept explanations that didn't fit what was happening in my body and insisted on further investigation that did, in fact, lead to diagnosis and surgery. So yes, a person may reasonably decide, I need somebody to talk to, but I don't want this conversation entered into the medical system. I don't want anxiety, trauma, depression, or an unusual spiritual experience becoming the lens through which every future doctor sees me. That can be a practical act of self-protection. Being anti-therapy isn't necessarily anti-help. Spiritual pathologizing is another real concern. A clinician may be culturally familiar with Christianity, prayer, angels, God speaking through scripture. Feeling called to ministry and the presence of the Holy Spirit may all seem like recognizable religious experiences. The same clinician may react very differently to mediumship, witchcraft, trance, possession traditions, deities, ancestors, land spirits, divination, or communication with the dead. Instead of asking what the experience means within the person's culture, whether it's welcome, whether it's distressing, how it affects daily life, they may treat the unfamiliarity itself as evidence of illness. In one cultural consultation service, 34 out of 70 patients referred with a psychotic disorder diagnosis were reclassified as having non-psychotic conditions after a more culturally informed evaluation. That doesn't mean psychosis is never real. It means culture changes how an experience should be understood. And clinicians can make serious mistakes when they don't know the client's world. When I discuss an unusual spiritual experience with another spiritual practitioner, we can usually begin with its meaning. What happened? How did it feel? Does it fit my practice? What did I learn? Was it welcome? What relationship does it create? In a clinical setting, I often have to begin with one step earlier and decide whether it's safe to mention the experience at all. It's exhausting. I usually don't bother. And I want to be equally clear that wonderful counselors exist. I have found some wonderful counselors. Counselors who are thoughtful, culturally responsive, curious, humble, and able to hear spiritual material without either ridiculing it or just swallowing it whole. I've experienced counselors who have made room for my worldview and helped me feel supported rather than observed. Unfortunately, they tend to be wonderful enough that someone offers them an amazing new job almost immediately after I meet them, and then I'm back in the queue waiting to see who has an opening. The system is cruel, and the counselor lottery is scary. Organizations within the counseling profession have developed competencies and best practices for addressing spiritual and religious issues. The field is learning that spirituality can be integrated into care without being imposed, and that a counselor needs to examine their own beliefs and biases rather than treating themselves as religiously neutral by default. That work matters, and I'm so excited that it's happening. But just as counseling can pathologize religious experiences, spiritual communities can make the opposite error. They can spiritualize psychological, psychiatric, neurological, or medical problems. I've encountered people who are terrified, unable to sleep, unable to eat, losing the ability to function, and convinced that demons, spirits, governments, family members, or electronic devices were controlling or communicating through them. I don't need to, and I can't diagnose those people myself to know that a tarot reading isn't sufficient care. Those are situations where I'm going to recommend professional mental health and medical evaluation. This is what I mean when I say the practices are co-equal but not interchangeable. My willingness to refer someone to a clinician doesn't mean spiritual practice is less legitimate. It means I know the limits of my tools. And this is also where I use the phrase, triage is not ontology. I can't prove that possession is impossible. Maybe there are spiritual conditions that could produce experiences resembling psychosis, dissociation, mania, or schizophrenia. I'm a spiritual practitioner. I'm not going to stand here and declare that only material explanations can ever exist. But I don't have to settle the metaphysics before deciding what the safest first step is. We know that psychiatric conditions can cause hallucinations, paranoia, disorganization, severe mood changes, and altered behavior. We know that neurological illness, infection, sleep deprivation, medication effects, substances, hormonal changes, metabolic problems, and other medical conditions can also alter perception and behavior. Those possibilities can be evaluated, and some of them require urgent treatment. So I'm going to suggest a medical and mental health evaluation much faster than I'm going to suggest an exorcism. That's not a rejection of spirituality, it's safety first. A spiritual practitioner can remain part of the support system. We can listen without ridicule, pray with the person if they want prayer, help them ground, discuss gentle protection practices, support sleep and ordinary care, and help them interpret the experience within their tradition while they're also being evaluated. What we shouldn't do is declare possession as diagnosis, tell someone that medication feeds an entity, insist that questioning us makes the attachment stronger or brings it back, or turn every worsening symptom into proof that our spiritual diagnosis was right. There are spiritual systems that do exactly that. Some folks teach that spiritual attachments are the cause of mental health symptoms and try to convince therapists, counselors, and doctors to consult with them even before diagnosis. In material describing self-selected cases of spiritual possession or witchcraft, one organization claims that spirits were attached in 85% of the suspected cases. It describes diagnoses ranging from anxiety and depression to psychosis and schizophrenia, claims that releasing spirits resulted in the end of auditory hallucinations and recovery from psychosis, and says this method should be taught in medical schools and used throughout mental health care institutions. That's quite a pitch. The problem isn't just that these practitioners believe spirits exist. The problem is that a selected population already suspected of possession was evaluated through a system built to detect possession, however that works. And the system's own findings were treated as confirmation that possession was present. That's not an independent diagnostic process. It doesn't establish that schizophrenia is caused by spirits, and it doesn't demonstrate that their method treats psychosis. And it certainly doesn't justify asking mental health professionals to place a spiritual scan upstream of ordinary clinical evaluation. Client-led spiritual integration sounds more like this. My spiritual beliefs are important to me. I want my counselor to understand them and include them where they're relevant. Practitioner-led imposition sounds more like this. Before your mental health can be evaluated, our spiritual system needs to determine which entities, curses, attachments, past lives, or energetic intrusions are causing your symptoms. Those aren't the same thing. The first respects the client. The second makes one metaphysical system compulsory and prejudices the clinical evaluation before it even begins. Interestingly, even official Catholic guidance distinguishes psychological illness from possession and says a person should receive thorough medical, psychological, and psychiatric examination before referral for a major exorcism. So even within a tradition that formally practices exorcism, the stated order is evaluation first. Again, triage is not ontology. You don't have to decide what is possible in the entire universe before deciding what is least likely to harm the person standing in front of you. Let's make all of this more concrete. Imagine someone is going through a breakup. A counselor may help them explore attachment, abandonment, grief, self-esteem, relationship patterns, compulsive contact, emotional regulation, or the way earlier experiences are being activated in the present. A tarot reader may help them explore the meaning of the relationship, the choices available now, the spiritual lessons they understand themselves to be moving through, possible future trajectories, or what they're being invited to recognize about themselves. The tarot reader may also answer whether the cards suggest the ex will return and whether renewed contact is healthy. Different tools, different tasks, some possible overlap. Now imagine someone has crossed over. A counselor can help with grief, depression, traumatic memories, disrupted functioning, guilt, anger, and the moments when loss becomes so overwhelming that the person can't carry on with ordinary life. A minister can conduct funeral rites, lead prayer, hold vigil, bring the community together, help the family fulfill religious obligations, and locate the death within the community's understanding of what happens after life. A medium may help the bereaved person seek a message, ask a final question, or experience an ongoing bond with the dead. Those practices are not interchangeable, but a grieving person may find value in any of them. Now imagine chronic illness or disability. A counselor may help someone grieve lost capacities, adapt to a changed body, process medical trauma, navigate identity, respond to changes in relationships, and build emotional or nervous system supports for living with uncertainty. A spiritual practitioner may help create rites of transition, explore anger at the gods or ancestors, maintain a relationship with the sacred, build spiritual practices around a changed body, or ask what meaning the person wants to make. Both practitioners need enough humility to admit that their lens is not the whole landscape. And then there are voices, visions, trance, presences, synchronicities, and other extraordinary experiences. A spiritual practitioner may help explore whether the experience is consistent with a person's tradition, whether it's welcome, how it should be interpreted, and what spiritual boundaries or practices may be appropriate. A clinician may help assess distress, function, control, sleep, mood, trauma, substance use, medication, neurological symptoms, and safety. Counseling has regulation, and that regulation is valuable. Licensure, supervision, education, ethical codes, complaint systems, and disciplinary authority can provide real protections. But regulation isn't moral purity. A license doesn't prevent bias, abuse, incompetence, spiritual imposition, or a terrible therapeutic fit. Spiritual advising usually doesn't have one universal licensing system, but that doesn't mean it lacks ethics, training, or accountability. Religious spiritual traditions may have ordination standards, initiatory requirements, apprenticeships, lineages, community norms, pastoral duties, codes of conduct, and consequences within the tradition. At the same time, the commercial spiritual marketplace can contain practitioners with no meaningful training, no supervision, no community accountability, no complaint process, and no one positioned to stop them from exploiting a frightened person. There are also good reasons to be cautious about state regulation of diverse spiritual practices. In a society with a dominant religion, a government standard for legitimate spirituality could very easily privilege that dominant religion's practices while treating minority religions as fraudulent, dangerous, or mentally suspect. So the absence of a universal spiritual license has both advantages and risks. It protects religious diversity, and it places more responsibility on clients and communities to practice discernment. And discernment is still necessary in counseling too. A practitioner can be licensed and ethical in a general sense, and still be completely wrong for you. A spiritual advisor can be kind, sincere, and beloved by their community, and still lack the competence for the problem you're bringing them. Friendly is not the same as qualified. Credentials is not the same thing as safe. Sincere is not the same as correct. So what are some warning signs? In spiritual care, I'm concerned when a practitioner claims certainty about a client's reality while denying the client's own perceptions. I'm concerned when a practitioner introduces a fear the client didn't have before and then sells the solution. Suddenly there's a curse, an attachment, an entity, a portal, a psychic attack, an ancestral debt, or a spiritual contamination. And now the client needs cleansing, then another cleansing, then stronger protection, then emergency work. The threat keeps escalating, and the practitioner remains the only person who can fix it. That's a warning sign. I become concerned when a practitioner says nobody else will understand, discourages outside perspectives, or tells the client not to discuss what happened. Isolation is a classic method of control. I become concerned when skepticism is treated as spiritual vulnerability. If questioning the practitioner supposedly makes the entity stronger, opens the client to attack, proves they are unhealed, or shows that negative forces are interfering, then the system has protected itself from examination. I become concerned when somebody predicts death, violence, illness, catastrophe, or betrayal as certain fact, especially when the claim creates panic and the practitioner offers a paid way to prevent it. I become concerned when a spiritual practitioner presents a medical or psychiatric diagnosis as certainty, tells someone to stop treatment, or insists that doctors and counselors can't be trusted because only the spiritual practitioner understands what's really happening. Seeking a second opinion is reasonable. Asking questions about treatment is reasonable. Deciding that a particular clinician is unsafe is reasonable. But replacing all outside care with one person's spiritual authority is dangerous. And I become very concerned when the client becomes afraid to leave, stop paying, question the reading, or think about the experience differently. Good spiritual care should strengthen discernment. It should not make someone terrified of their own mind or authority. And counseling has warning signs too. I become concerned when a clinician imposes their religion, atheism, or anti-theism on the client. I become concerned when unfamiliar spirituality is treated as pathology without an effort to understand the person's culture, tradition, and meaning. I become concerned when a clinician ignores racism, sexism, ableism, poverty, ageism, fatphobia, sizeism, homophobia, transphobia, medical illness, or other material conditions and turns every problem into an individual failure to cope correctly. I become concerned when a diagnosis is used to dismiss clients' testimony. You have anxiety, so your physical symptoms aren't real. You have trauma, so your concerns about this person can't be trusted. You have a psychotic disorder diagnosis, so nothing you report requires investigation. A diagnosis should help organize care. It should not erase the person. I become concerned when a clinician believes licensure makes them unbiased or culturally neutral. And I become concerned when Christian prayer, forgiveness, sin, submission, divine purpose, or any other theology enters treatment without the client's explicit invitation. And I become concerned when a client asks for secular counseling and that request is treated as resistance, avoidance, or spiritual deficiency. consent is central on both roads at all times. The client should know what kind of service is being offered and what the practitioner can and cannot do, what records are kept, what confidentiality means in the setting, and when a referral may be necessary. The client should be able to disagree. They should be able to ask questions. They should be able to stop. They should not have to accept the practitioner's worldview as the price of receiving care. And the practitioner should be able to say, "This is not my lane." I have said that many times in my spiritual practice. I have lost count of how often someone has brought me something and I have said, "This needs professional mental health support," or "You need to talk to a doctor," or "A tarot reading is not the right tool for this." That does not diminish my work. It demonstrates that I take it very seriously. A competent counselor also refers out when a client needs expertise they don't have. Knowing the limits of a discipline is part of honoring the discipline. This is part of why I'm pursuing clinical training. Counseling, somatics, trauma work, and chronic illness research matter to me. I want to understand more about how emotion, thought, history, culture, trauma, and the nervous system move through the body. And I want another tool. I'm not trying to graduate from spiritual practice into something more legitimate. I'm already a tarot reader, spiritual practitioner, and ordained minister. That work has dignity, it has value, it has a lineage and a purpose. I'm pursuing counseling because I keep being called to the work, so I should learn both tools. There will still be times when I'm acting as a minister or spiritual practitioner and I say, "You should see a counselor." There may be times when I'm acting as a counselor and recognize you'll want to discuss this with your spiritual advisor. Ethical spiritual care doesn't demand that people trust systems that have harmed them. It also doesn't turn their distrust into a reason they must depend exclusively on us. Ethical counseling doesn't require people to abandon the spiritual frameworks that sustain them. It also doesn't impose spirituality where the client hasn't invited it. Two roads, both alike in dignity. Both useful, both capable of harm, both responsible for knowing where they do and do not lead. Neither one is a substitute for the other, and neither one is inherently superior.